I'm sorry, ma'am, but we need you to give up your seat. The words landed like a slap. Cold. Entitled. Final. Amara James blinked once, slowly, her fingers still resting on the polished leather armrest of seat 1A, her seat, the one she had reserved, paid for, and boarded early just to secure. The flight attendant, crisply dressed and visibly uncomfortable, stood over her with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Behind him, a blonde woman in an expensive beige trench coat tapped her designer heels impatiently, arms crossed, lips pursed in visible irritation. Amara didn't move. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but sharpened with warning. The flight attendant hesitated. He glanced over his shoulder at the woman standing behind him. "Mrs. Hartwell here says she's a Platinum Elite member and always flies in this seat. There may have been a mix-up." "No," Amara's voice sliced clean through his sentence. "There was no mix-up. My name is on the ticket. The boarding pass says 1A. That makes this my seat." The blonde woman, Veronica Hartwell, stepped forward now, clearly done letting the staff speak for her. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she snapped. "I don't know how these mistakes keep happening. I fly this route every month. I always get 1A. Everyone knows that." Amara turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking with Veronica's. There was no anger there, no heat. Just an immovable wall of quiet strength. "I'm sure you do," she replied evenly. "But not today." A murmur stirred through the first-class cabin. Veronica leaned toward her, dropping her voice into something low and caustic. "Listen. I'm not trying to be difficult. But you'd be more comfortable a few rows back. Don't make a scene. Just be reasonable." That word. Reasonable. It was always the word they used when they were asking you to shrink. To surrender. To disappear gracefully so they didn't have to look directly at you. Amara tilted her head. "I am being reasonable. I'm sitting in the seat I reserved. You're the one making a scene." The tension in the air became electric. Nearby passengers, previously absorbed in their devices or champagne, now looked up, first with casual curiosity, then with something else. Some lowered their eyes again. A few leaned slightly forward, as if hoping to catch every word. Veronica's composure cracked. Her cheeks flushed. "I don't think you understand who I am," she said, standing tall. "No," Amara replied, slowly standing too. "I don't. And I don't need to." Just then, another uniformed attendant arrived, this time a woman, older, with a name tag that read Deborah Lane, flight supervisor. She approached the scene briskly, smiling thinly as if walking into a boardroom mid-crisis. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Veronica spoke first. "Yes, there is. I'm a Platinum Elite member. This seat was assigned to me every time I fly. I don't know how this mistake happened, but I need it resolved now." Deborah turned to Amara, who was now holding out her boarding pass with the calm assurance of a woman who had dealt with far worse than microaggressions disguised as airline policy. "Seat 1A. Amara James," she said, handing it over. Deborah scanned the pass. Then double-checked her tablet. Her eyes tightened ever so slightly. "This boarding pass is valid," she admitted. "But Mrs. Hartwell." "But what?" Amara cut in. Deborah hesitated. "Would you be willing to switch to 2C? It's still first class. Just to make things easier." "To make what easier?" Amara asked, her voice quiet but resolute. "To avoid making your platinum guest uncomfortable. Or to avoid doing what's right." Veronica scoffed. "Oh, please. You're acting like this is some kind of civil rights issue." Amara raised an eyebrow. It's not, she asked. A white woman demands a seat from a black woman who rightfully owns it, gets the staff to intervene on her behalf, and expects obedience without question. What would you call it? You could have heard a pin drop. Deborah glanced around nervously. Ma'am, I assure you this has nothing to do with. Spare me, Amara interrupted, turning to her seat and calmly sitting back down. We both know what this is. Veronica's face flushed a deeper red now. You don't belong here, she muttered under her breath. And that was it. Not loud. Not screamed. But loud enough. Everyone heard it. Deborah paled. The young male flight attendant took a step back. A businessman too rose up, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A woman with a tablet dropped her stylus. Amara didn't flinch. She reached into her designer tote, pulled out her phone, and typed something quietly. Veronica opened her mouth to speak again, but Amara raised a finger. No more, she said firmly. You've said enough. Veronica's mouth hung open in disbelief. This isn't over, she hissed. Amara looked at her and gave the softest, most terrifying smile Veronica had ever seen. No, she agreed. It's just beginning. And with that, she pressed send. Within 5 minutes, the captain received a call from corporate headquarters. Within 10 minutes, the gate agent returned to the plane looking pale and confused. Within 15 minutes, 2 men in suits boarded the flight, asked for the flight supervisor and the 2 flight attendants, and requested a brief word in the galley. And within 25 minutes, the flight was delayed. Veronica didn't understand. Not yet. But Amara did. She leaned back in her seat, adjusted her scarf, and sipped the sparkling water she had ordered before all the chaos began. She wasn't just a passenger. She was Amara James, founder of Andromeda Technologies, whose AI platform was currently being reviewed for acquisition by multiple global governments. She sat on 2 Fortune 500 advisory boards. She held silent equity in the airline itself. And she was done asking to be respected. The delay wasn't long, barely 20 minutes, but inside the pressurized air of the first-class cabin, it stretched like a shadow creeping beneath the skin. The engines had quieted. The boarding door remained sealed. The buzz of polite conversation had stilled to a hush, like a church just before a sermon. Outside, the evening lights on the tarmac blinked steadily, indifferent to the storm brewing inside the aircraft. Amara sat still, her posture perfect, her gaze directed at the window, but her thoughts far from it. Every detail of the encounter still hung in the air like vapor from something recently scorched. Her pulse had returned to its natural rhythm, measured, steady, but her mind replayed Veronica Hartwell's words on loop. You don't belong here. Not shouted. Not even said with fury. Just, stated. As if fact. As if gospel. But it wasn't the first time Amara had heard that phrase. Not by a long shot. Years ago, before Silicon Valley would return her calls, before venture capitalists would sit across from her with sheepish grins and notepads filled with diversity strategy, bullet points, she had sat in a college admissions office where a white guidance counselor had said something nearly identical. Tech is competitive, sweetheart. Maybe aim for something a little more practical. She had smiled then, too. The same smile she had given Veronica. The one that didn't reach her eyes but still said everything. Now, seated in her hard-won 1A seat, Amara felt the full weight of what it meant to exist unapologetically in a space where she wasn't expected, and wasn't wanted. Across the aisle, Veronica shifted in her seat like a woman sitting on a throne that had turned into thorns. Her arms were folded, her chin high, but her face twitched in slight, betraying movements, small spasms of disbelief, fury, and embarrassment. Her friend, a woman in her mid-50s with shoulder-length brunette hair and a softer energy, sat in an uneasy half-turn between solidarity and retreat. The friend spoke quietly, almost inaudibly. "Maybe just let it go, Ronnie. This is getting a little intense." But Veronica didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her mouth was a thin, hard line. Her gaze locked not on Amara, but on Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor who had just returned from the galley looking several shades paler than she had 15 minutes ago. Deborah's steps were heavier now. Her professionalism, once crisp and curated, had been replaced by the hunted gait of someone who had just been handed a warning. She didn't look at Amara as she passed. She didn't look at Veronica either. She just moved toward the front of the plane, adjusted her blazer, and whispered something to the pilot through the cockpit door. The murmurs in the cabin resumed, but lower now, laced with restraint. Amara caught pieces of conversations. "She's somebody. I'm telling you. You think she called the CEO? Did you see the men in suits? The passengers weren't stupid. They could feel it, the shift in gravity, that subtle reorientation of power. Something had changed. The woman in 1A wasn't just another passenger anymore. She wasn't just an obstacle in Veronica's way. She was something else entirely. But what unsettled Veronica more than the delay, more than the quiet deference from the crew now, was this. Amara hadn't raised her voice. Not once. She hadn't yelled. Hadn't cried. Hadn't made a scene. She had simply existed, with clarity and resolve, in a space that Veronica had always assumed belonged to people like her. The silence that followed was more dangerous than 1,000 screaming matches. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Harold Trent stood with one hand resting on the back of the co-pilot's chair, his jaw tight. "She's on the board?" he asked, voice low. Deborah nodded. "That's what they said." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his silvering hair. "Jesus. And you tried to bump her?" "I didn't bump her," Deborah said defensively. "I asked if she would consider moving to resolve the situation quietly." Harold gave her a sharp look. "You asked the one passenger on the flight with corporate leverage to move, to keep the peace?" Deborah opened her mouth, then closed it. "She didn't say who she was," she mumbled. "She didn't have to." Back in her seat, Amara finally opened her notebook, not the digital kind, but a sleek, leather-bound volume she always traveled with. Its pages were filled with careful handwriting, notes, strategies, inspirations. It was her private space, sacred in its way, a reflection of how she built her empire. She didn't write anything now. She simply opened the page to a quote she had copied down months ago, a line from Audre Lorde. "Your silence will not protect you." It had been her armor and her war cry all in one. Veronica had expected a fight. Screaming. Drama. Tears. Something she could dismiss later as overreaction. Instead, she had been met with precision. The phone call. The email. The delay. And now the power had shifted, and Veronica could feel it in her bones. 15 rows back in economy class, a teenage girl named Alicia sat beside her mother, quietly watching the whole thing unfold through the gap between two seats. She had seen it all. Her mother was flipping through a magazine, pretending not to notice, but Alicia's eyes were wide, her lips parted slightly. She had never seen a black woman hold that much power in a room without saying more than a few sentences. "Mom," she whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Emicham? Who is she?" Her mother glanced toward the front, where Amara sat framed by the window light like a portrait. She didn't answer immediately. "Someone who earned her place," she said finally. "And isn't afraid to prove it." Alicia smiled faintly. She would remember this flight for the rest of her life. By the time the two men in corporate suits returned to the cabin, the atmosphere was tense with expectation. No announcement had been made yet, but everyone on board knew something was coming. They walked directly to Deborah Lane and the younger attendant, Chris, whose awkward glances and fidgeting hands had betrayed his discomfort since the beginning. A low conversation followed, too quiet to hear, but Amara didn't need to hear the words. She could read the posture. Dismissal. Reprimand. Consequences. Moments later, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice, calm but edged with something new, formality dipped in apology. "We thank you for your patience. Due to an internal personnel reassignment, we'll be making a brief adjustment in the crew before takeoff. We appreciate your understanding." The corporate men escorted Deborah and Chris off the plane, their exit hushed and fast. No one clapped. No one cheered. But no one looked away either. Veronica was rigid in her seat now, eyes wide in disbelief, her composure crumbling. She leaned toward her friend and hissed under her breath, "Do you see what's happening? They're punishing us for a misunderstanding." Her friend said nothing. Just looked down. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a reckoning. When Amara finally met eyes with the corporate liaison, tall, African-American, late 40s, salt and pepper hair, he paused beside her row, nodded respectfully, and said softly, "We apologize for what happened today. Action has been taken." She met his gaze. "Has it? Or was this just triage?" He blinked, then offered her a business card. "Let's talk after landing. We're ready to listen." She took it without smiling. "I hope so," she said. "Because I'm done explaining." He nodded again and walked on. She closed her notebook and stared straight ahead. The plane finally taxied forward. And somewhere in that quiet movement, something far larger had begun to shift. The plane had begun to taxi. From the outside, everything looked as it should, the sleek body of the aircraft inching forward across the glittering tarmac beneath the soft blue glow of runway lights. Inside, however, the cabin of Flight 9047 was anything but calm. A different kind of engine was roaring now, not of metal or turbine, but the growing hum of whispers, glances, and the invisible shift of perception. Veronica Hartwell was unraveling. Not publicly, at least not yet, but in the restrained, slow-cracking manner that always preceded collapse. She sat stiffly in her assigned seat, 3A, with her hands tightly gripping the armrests, her breathing shallow, and her cheeks mottled with red. Her posture remained rigid, but her control was gone. She had never lost before. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. Veronica had always believed in systems. Not justice systems or ethics, systems of status. Of loyalty points. Credit tiers. Inner circles. She knew which champagne to ask for by name, which concierges to tip in advance, which flight attendants would whisper upgrades under their breath for the right kind of passenger. She had lived her adult life insulated by invisible velvet ropes. But today, those ropes had burned in her hands. 2 flight staff members dismissed. A 20-minute delay. A personal visit from corporate. And a woman, black woman who didn't flinch even once. Amara James. Veronica hadn't known her name when she first laid eyes on her in 1A. Now it echoed in her head, over and over, like a verdict she hadn't seen coming. Amara James. Amara James. Amara James. She turned slightly in her seat and looked forward. Amara was sitting cross-legged again, elegant, serene. Her notebook rested in her lap. Her fingers were still. Her scarf, silk, likely custom, was now perfectly retied. Her posture. Regal. Not a single flicker of smugness crossed her face. And yet, Her very existence in that seat now felt like judgment. It was infuriating. It was devastating. And worst of all, it was being watched. 3 rows behind, a young woman named Clara tapped her boyfriend gently on the arm. "Do you know who she is?" she whispered, glancing toward Amara. "No," he murmured. "But, she's someone." Clara leaned in. "She didn't say much. That's what's killing me. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She just stayed still. And the whole system fell over." Her boyfriend shrugged, still watching. That's the kind of power people don't see coming. And suddenly, Clara realized something else: people were choosing sides. They weren't saying it aloud. Not yet. But in their eyes, in the way some leaned slightly forward and others leaned slightly away, the line had been drawn. Veronica wasn't the center of gravity anymore. Amara was. Veronica's friend, Linda, had also noticed. She sat next to Veronica, increasingly uncomfortable, her spine tensed against the silence between them. She'd seen the glances, too. A man across the aisle had nodded subtly in Amara's direction after the corporate escort. The woman in 2D had offered Amara a tissue earlier when it looked like she might have been wiping her eyes, though Amara hadn't taken it. These were tiny moments, yes. But in first class, tiny gestures were tectonic. Linda leaned toward her friend carefully. "Ronnie," she whispered, "maybe we should just let it go. Just enjoy the flight." Veronica didn't even look at her. "She humiliated me." Linda frowned. "Did she? Or did we just assume wrong?" Veronica's head snapped toward her so sharply that Linda flinched. "Are you taking her side?" "I'm not taking sides," Linda said quickly. "I'm just saying, this is starting to feel, well, earned." Veronica stared at her friend for a long second. Then she leaned back, lips pressed so tightly together they seemed to disappear. She folded her arms again and glared straight ahead. But her mind was anything but still. She was spiraling now. Quietly. Silently. Fatally. In the galley, the remaining crew were walking on eggshells. Sophia, the only attendant not caught in the earlier incident, was now shouldering the weight of the service experience alone. She was a petite woman in her 30s, sharp-eyed and discreet. She hadn't spoken to Amara since the event, not directly, but she had refilled her sparkling water without asking. Had nodded when Amara caught her eye. Small acts of reparation. She moved through the cabin now, offering hot towels and quiet comfort. She didn't look at Deborah's empty seat in the jump seat row. She didn't need to. It was a ghost now. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. The engines had engaged fully. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We are now next in line for departure. Flight time to Zurich will be approximately 8 hours and 30 minutes. Please prepare for takeoff." A few passengers sighed in relief. Some clapped lightly. But Amara remained still. And Veronica? Veronica felt a strange hollowness she hadn't known before. The departure was happening, yes. But it felt like her reputation wasn't coming with her. She opened her clutch bag and pulled out her phone. She began typing, fast, emotional, angry. A long message. She paused halfway through, then deleted it. Rewrote it. Deleted it again. Then, finally, she opened her email and began to write to someone at corporate. She would escalate. She would reclaim the narrative. She had to. But somewhere inside, Veronica felt it, she had already lost the room. Across the aisle, Amara finally shifted. She glanced out the window as the plane lifted from the runway, clean and smooth. The moment they broke free from the ground, a small breath escaped her lips. Not relief. Resolve. She pulled her notebook to her lap again and opened to a fresh page. The same elegant handwriting flowed like silk across the paper as she began to jot down ideas, not about the Zurich partnership, not about Andromeda's next product rollout, but about what this flight had revealed. There was a larger pattern. And it was time someone illuminated it. Later, when dinner was served, Veronica was offered a glass of wine. She declined. Amara, by contrast, accepted hers with a gracious nod. She took a sip, then turned the glass slowly in her hand, studying the light within it. It wasn't a toast. It was a message. The plane was 30,000 feet in the air. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly, ink black and dusted with starlight. Inside, the cabin lights had dimmed, casting a soft amber glow over the first-class section. Meals had been served and cleared. Conversations had dwindled into murmurs or silence. Some passengers slept, lulled by the soft hum of engines and the lullaby of altitude. But Amara James was wide awake. She sat quietly, legs crossed, her notebook closed but still resting in her lap. Her phone lay face down on the tray table beside her, screen dark. In her hand, she turned a slim fountain pen slowly between her fingers, a meditative motion, as if weighing every decision she'd made in the last 3 hours. Across the aisle, Veronica Hartwell had stopped pretending to rest. Her eyes remained open, her body rigid, arms folded across her chest like a barricade. The mask of superiority she had worn at boarding had all but dissolved. She had tried to reclaim the narrative. She'd written emails, angry, defensive, and embellished. To corporate. To her travel concierge. Even to a PR consultant, she kept on retainer. She had drafted a post she nearly uploaded to LinkedIn before deleting it at the last second. But none of it mattered. Not really. Because in that cabin, at 30,000 feet, Amara owned the room now. And Veronica couldn't shake the feeling that everyone around her knew it, even the ones pretending not to look. In row 4C, a man in his 50s, clean-shaven, with a journalist's eyes and the discreet curiosity of someone trained to observe without inserting himself, typed quietly on his laptop. His name was Daniel Brome, a contributor for The Atlantic, en route to Zurich for an economic forum. He'd watched the entire incident play out with fascination. He hadn't heard Amara's name initially, but he had seen her business card discreetly passed to the flight supervisor. He had watched how the corporate men reacted. The delay. The tension. The surrender. Now, midair, he had taken a chance during meal service and quietly asked Sophia, the remaining flight attendant, if she knew who the woman in 1A was. Sophia had hesitated. Then, without giving much away, she simply whispered. Check Forbes. So Daniel had. And what he found, stunned him. Amara James. Founder and CEO of Andromeda Technologies. Net worth, $1.2 billion. Board member at 2 global airlines. Major investor in public infrastructure AI. Advisor to the U.S. Department of Technology Ethics. And black. And female. And silent as a blade. Daniel sat back in his seat, closed the laptop, and whistled softly under his breath. No wonder the flight had stopped cold. This woman wasn't just someone. She was the storm after the silence. Meanwhile, the seatbelt light flickered back on as they approached turbulence. A few passengers stirred. A baby cried faintly in economy, muffled behind cabin doors. Veronica pressed the call button. She didn't know why, exactly. Maybe she needed water. Or reassurance. Or revenge. Sophia arrived promptly, patient and graceful as ever. Yes, Mrs. Hartwell. Veronica paused, then lifted her chin. I'd like to know, she said carefully, why I was treated the way I was earlier. I am a Platinum Elite member. I've spent more than $500,000 with this airline in the last 8 years. And yet, I was ignored. Humiliated. Passed over. Sophia nodded once, remaining composed. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said neutrally. But I believe everything that occurred was in accordance with policy. Veronica gave a tight, incredulous laugh. Oh, policy. So now we're hiding behind policies. Not hiding, ma'am, Sophia said. Following. Veronica's voice lowered into something sharper. I was disrespected. Sophia didn't respond. Instead, she turned slightly, her voice lowering as she added, May I remind you, Mrs. Hartwell, that another complaint has been logged. Regarding your earlier language. Veronica's lips parted in disbelief. Excuse me. Sophia's expression didn't change. Several passengers have provided witness statements. I believe corporate is reviewing them. I can't say more. The words landed with a finality Veronica wasn't prepared for. Someone had filed a complaint against her. People had heard what she said. People had listened. And they weren't taking her side. Amara, still seated quietly, was aware of it all. She didn't look toward Veronica. She didn't gloat. She didn't have to. Her power now wasn't in her words, it was in everyone else's silence. An hour later, as the cabin slipped into deeper stillness, the first-class door opened quietly. The senior in-flight manager entered with a soft knock on the bulkhead. She moved down the aisle, leaned down beside Amara, and whispered something into her ear. Amara nodded, stood, and followed her calmly to the galley at the front. There, 2 men in business attire waited. One of them, Marcus Taylor, offered her a respectful nod. The other was the airline's vice president of international affairs. Amara's presence had pulled weight up the ladder. We wanted to speak to you privately, Marcus began, about the way things were handled earlier. We're reviewing the footage from the cabin. Corporate is launching a formal investigation. The VP nodded. And beyond the incident itself, we understand that your position as a board advisor warrants a higher level of communication and response. We're here to reaffirm that. Amara listened without interrupting. I'm not interested in apologies, she said when they finished. I'm interested in process. Marcus nodded slowly. Understood. I want to know, Amara continued, what protocol allowed a paying customer, one with a confirmed ticket, to be asked multiple times to surrender her seat to another passenger based purely on status. The VP fumbled slightly. It's not typical, ma'am. But sometimes supervisors are asked to de-escalate. No, Amara interrupted. Don't soften it. This wasn't de-escalation. It was an enabling privilege. Your staff didn't ask me to move because of an overbooking issue. They asked because they assumed the white woman belonged there more than I did. Marcus looked her in the eyes. You're right. Amara exhaled slowly. Then don't just correct the behavior. Correct the culture. The VP nodded. We'll begin revising training procedures immediately. We'd also like to offer. I don't want compensation, Amara said sharply. I want accountability. And then, more quietly, not just for me. For everyone who's been treated like this without the benefit of corporate pull. Marcus's eyes softened. You have my word, he said. Back in the cabin, Veronica was unraveling fully now. She had heard whispers. Seen glances. Her stomach twisted every time someone walked down the aisle and didn't look at her with sympathy. She had always assumed people would take her side. That status meant solidarity. But status had turned into scrutiny. Her Platinum Elite card meant nothing now. Her empire of influence had become a paper fortress in the rain. And just when she thought things couldn't get worse, Sophia returned. She handed her a sealed envelope. Veronica frowned. "What's this?" "An official notice," Sophia said, keeping her tone polite. "You're being informed that your membership is under review pending investigation. A temporary suspension has been enacted. Your travel privileges will continue, but upgrades and priority benefits have been paused." Veronica's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious." Sophia gave a gentle bow. "The matter is now in the hands of corporate compliance." As she walked away, Veronica's fingers trembled over the envelope. No tears came. Just silence. And for the first time in a long time, she knew what it meant to feel small. When Amara returned to her seat, she didn't look toward Veronica. She simply picked up her pen again. And wrote. Power doesn't speak louder. It simply doesn't need to ask permission. She underlined it once. Folded the page. And closed the book. By the time Flight 9047 began its descent into Zurich, the sky was a pale canvas of silver and blue. Morning had broken over the Swiss Alps, casting soft light over their snowy ridges like a whisper of peace that felt almost ironic, because peace was the last thing waiting on the ground. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the incident that had unfolded quietly in first class had gone viral. It started with a blurry photo, a shot snapped discreetly by a young woman in 2D, showing Amara James seated calmly in 1A, while a visibly frustrated Veronica stood over her, one arm gesturing mid-demand. The photo had been posted to Twitter with a simple caption. This woman refused to give up her seat to a platinum elite member who thought she deserved it more. She stayed calm. And she won. By the time the plane touched down, the tweet had over 40,000 shares, and hashtag Seat1A was trending in 6 countries. Amara hadn't posted it. She hadn't said a word online. But the world had seen enough, and the world responded. Back inside the cabin, the atmosphere was strange, stretched between fatigue and tension, between quiet admiration and the buzz of something bigger than any of them could name. Sophia moved through the aisle with a new ease, now carrying the quiet assurance of someone who knew she had done the right thing and that it had mattered. Her eyes met Amara's as she reached her row. "Would you like assistance disembarking, Miss James?" she asked softly. Amara shook her head with a gentle smile. "No, thank you. I prefer to exit last." Sophia nodded with quiet understanding. Of course. Veronica, seated several rows back, had not slept. Her eyes were puffy, her posture sunken. She had gone silent since receiving the envelope mid-flight. She hadn't spoken to Linda in over 2 hours. She had ignored the food, ignored the flight crew, and now clutched her carry-on like a life raft in a storm of her own making. When the wheels touched the ground, her knuckles turned white around the handle. She had never felt this exposed. She had never felt this powerless. Amara's phone vibrated the moment she turned it back on. It exploded with alerts. Emails, missed calls, texts from colleagues, journalists, board members, even her mother. She thumbed through them quickly, recognizing Marcus's name at the top. Marcus Taylor. You've gone viral. Just so you know, the NYT and BBC have already reached out. We've got your back. Below that was a text from her younger sister. Nina James. Just saw you on Twitter. That smile. Queen behavior. Mom says to remind you, don't curse anyone out, yet. Amara allowed herself a soft exhale and smiled despite herself. No press statement. No tweet. No media tour. Just stillness, and truth. And somehow, the world had heard her anyway. By the time the plane reached the gate, ground staff were already waiting. Amara watched quietly as a woman in a navy blue blazer boarded and conferred with Sophia. They exchanged brief words. Then the woman turned her eyes toward Amara, nodded respectfully, and waited. It was clear she was not here for Veronica. The plane began to deboard, row by row. Veronica was in the third. She hesitated, but Linda stood before her. "Are you coming?" Linda asked gently, the first word she had spoken in hours. Veronica didn't respond. Passengers passed her. Some gave her a wide berth. A few stole furtive glances. Others looked at her with the kind of practiced indifference only wealthy people know how to deploy in public when they witness the fall of one of their own. When Veronica finally stood, it wasn't with dignity. It was with a kind of hollow defeat. She walked stiffly, her chin raised, but her eyes flinching each time they met someone else's. No one offered help. No one offered kindness. The silence that greeted her now was not out of respect, but isolation. Amara stood last, her briefcase in one hand, notebook in the other. She walked down the jet bridge slowly, every step quiet but unshaken. When she emerged into the terminal, the woman in the navy blazer stepped forward. "Miss James," she said warmly, "welcome to Zurich. I'm Ms. Keller, Director of International Client Relations. We've arranged for private transport, expedited customs, and press shielding as needed." Amara blinked once. "Press?" Ms. Keller's smile remained polite. "Yes. They're already here. The situation has become rather public. Corporate is requesting that we offer full support and discretion." Amara nodded. "I won't be giving a statement." "Not yet." "Understood." By mid-afternoon, news outlets were ablaze with the story. Tech CEO refuses to surrender seat to entitled elite, airline staff removed mid-flight. The Guardian. Flight 9047 incident, billionaire Amara James sparks global conversation on racial bias in luxury travel. CNN. Seat 1A, a symbol of power, resistance, and quiet justice. New York Times. Clips from old interviews with Amara resurfaced, TED Talks, commencement speeches, op-eds on equity and ethical tech. Hashtags multiplied. Hashtag Amara James, hashtag Quiet Power, and hashtag Respect is a Seat began trending globally. Thousands shared their own stories of being dismissed, relocated, or undermined during air travel. Black professionals. Asian women. Hijabi mothers. Trans passengers. Amara had become a mirror, reflecting the quiet injustice so many had endured without the platform to make it matter. But now, it mattered. Back in New York, Marcus sat in the boardroom of the airline's corporate HQ. Screens displayed social media metrics. Crisis teams spoke in clipped tones. Legal departments reviewed internal footage. The CEO, red-eyed and flustered, paced behind them all. "This is different," someone muttered. "We can't just apologize and throw vouchers at this." Marcus stood, adjusting his watch, then cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, with respect, if you'd listened when Amara first joined the board, we wouldn't be in this position. She warned you. She told you there was a culture problem. And you called it an exaggeration." Silence followed. Then Marcus added, "Now she's become the reform you refused to create." In a modest apartment in Baltimore, Amara's mother sat at the kitchen table, watching the news with tears in her eyes. She had always known her daughter was different. Focused. Fierce. Uncompromising. But this? This was more than a success. This was a legacy unfolding in real time. She picked up her phone and left Amara a voicemail, voice trembling but proud. "Baby, I saw what you did. You didn't shout. You didn't curse. You didn't even flinch. And the whole world finally saw what I've always known: you don't need noise to lead. You just need the truth. I love you. And somewhere in a luxury hotel in Zurich, Amara finally took a moment to rest. Her shoes were off. Her scarf lay folded across the arm of the sofa. Her notebook sat unopened on the coffee table. She held her phone, scrolled through the sea of messages, some angry, some grateful, some desperate. She knew what was coming. The praise. The backlash. The invitations to speak, to endorse, to tell her story for others to profit from. But she also knew this wasn't about her anymore. It was about the system. About the gatekeepers. About the quiet cruelty that gets handed out with a smile and a boarding pass. She put her phone down and looked out the window. Zurich was waking up below. A clean, modern city. Neutral. Efficient. Controlled. But power wasn't about control. It was about refusing to move, even when the world insists you must. And that refusal, she thought, would echo much further than any one flight. It would become policy. Culture. Memory. The boardroom on the 34th floor of the airline's Zurich headquarters was all glass and silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a museum exhibit: steel, sky, and immaculate symmetry. A long obsidian conference table stretched the length of the room, polished to a flawless sheen. Everything inside the space whispered status. Power. Order. But as Amara James stepped through the double doors, the room tilted subtly, irrevocably. 8 executives rose instinctively. Some smiled tightly. Others didn't smile at all. The CEO, Robert Langford, stepped forward with outstretched hands and nervous eyes. "Miss James," he said. "Thank you for meeting with us. I can't tell you how deeply sorry we are about what happened." Amara did not take his hand. Instead, she walked past him and sat down at the head of the table, the seat typically reserved for Robert himself. Her presence did not ask for permission. It was simply occupied. "I'm not here for apologies," she said calmly, removing a single sheet of paper from her notebook. "I'm here for solutions. Permanent ones." Robert hesitated, then slowly took the seat at her right. The others followed in uneasy silence. Amara glanced around the room, scanning faces. She recognized each of them: division heads, compliance chiefs, policy directors. She had sat on advisory calls with most of them. She had given lectures they'd applauded, memos they had skimmed. But now, for the first time, they had to listen. "I want to be very clear," Amara began, her voice crisp and controlled. "The incident on Flight 9047 wasn't about a seat. It was about a system that trained your staff to associate entitlement with loyalty, and deference with difference." A murmur passed between 2 directors. Robert tried to interject. "We understand that, and we are." "No," Amara cut him off. "You don't understand. If you did, Deborah Lane and her team would have been retrained long ago. Instead, they were rewarded for enforcing unspoken hierarchies. She assumed, based on skin tone and posture, that I was less important than the woman who barked orders. She was platinum elite," one man muttered, almost defensively. "So am I," Amara replied, without missing a beat. "Except I didn't wave my status around like a weapon. And even if I weren't a board-level advisor, the response should have been the same." Another executive, a woman in legal, cleared her throat gently. "We agree that retraining is necessary. We've already begun reviewing." "I don't want a PowerPoint deck on implicit bias," Amara said, her tone tightening. "I want structural change." She unfolded the paper. "Here's what I'm proposing," she continued. First, an independent audit of all customer complaints over the last 5 years, focused specifically on race, gender, and class-related disparities. Second, a new anti-bias protocol is embedded in every staff certification process. Not optional. Not a module. A requirement for employment. A few eyebrows rose. One executive looked as though he might object, but Amara raised a hand. Third, anonymous passenger surveys tied to specific routes, particularly premium cabins. We both know discriminatory patterns exist most clearly where status intersects with image. And who would oversee this? Someone asked. I would, Amara said. And I'll appoint a board. External. Intersectional. Transparent. The room went still. Robert exhaled. You're suggesting we allow an outside panel to regulate our internal culture? No, Amara replied. I'm telling you that if you want to keep my name, and my investment, associated with this company, you will. A long pause followed. Someone near the end of the table spoke quietly. You've become a symbol, Miss James. There's a lot of press. A lot of heat. But the cycle moves fast. In 2 weeks, another headline will push this out of the spotlight. Amara leaned forward slightly, folding her hands. That's where you're wrong, she said. Because I'm not going to let it fade. I'm not going to give a feel-good interview and move on. This isn't a trend for me. It's personal. And it's long overdue. Her gaze swept the table. You think I care about going viral? She asked. You think I planned that moment? I was just trying to fly in peace. What you saw wasn't a performance. It was a woman refusing, after years of compromise, to shrink for someone else's comfort. Robert rubbed the bridge of his nose. You're right. I know I am, Amara said. And here's the final point on my list. Your company will publicly endorse this reform initiative. Not with a vague tweet. Not with a stock photo and a hashtag. With actionable commitments, published. Measurable. Tracked. Another executive finally broke her silence. And if we don't? Amara sat back in the chair, composed. Then I will resign from your advisory board. I sell my shares. I go public with my story, my data, and my platform. And believe me, she smiled faintly. There are plenty of other airlines, journalists, and regulators who'd love to help me do that. The silence was absolute. In that moment, no one in the room saw a passenger. They saw a reformer. 3 days later, the airline released an official statement. Accountability in action, a new flight path toward equity and inclusion. It outlined Amara's proposals point for point, with full executive approval. Independent oversight. Revised protocols. Restorative policy reviews. A permanent committee co-chaired by Amara herself. The industry took notice. So did the public. So did Veronica Hartwell. Veronica read the statement from her penthouse in Manhattan, where she had returned 2 days prior. Her travel privileges were still suspended. Her client contracts were now under quiet review. Her name, once tied to exclusivity and elite travel, was now tied to humiliation. She had seen the videos. The stills. The memes. She had even seen an art piece online, Amara, seated calmly, with a burning plane in the background. The caption? She didn't raise her voice. The world raised its conscience. Veronica felt something in her chest crack, but not enough to call it guilt. Only the beginning of a long, slow reckoning. Not just in public, but within herself. Meanwhile, Amara stood before a crowd of 400 employees at a training facility in Chicago. She didn't bring a script. She didn't read from a mission statement. She simply stood and spoke the truth. Sometimes, change begins when someone refuses to move, not because they're stubborn, but because they've carried too many compromises on their back for too long. I didn't want to become a story. But since I did, let's make it a lesson that doesn't need repeating. And the room stood with her. Quiet at first. Then all at once. 2 weeks after the airline's public apology, Amara James was once again on a stage, but this time, the spotlight was not a metaphor. She stood beneath a vast glass dome at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, speaking before a global forum on institutional equity. Dignitaries, business leaders, heads of state, and NGO delegates filled the room. Her name had been the most requested on the summit's speaker list. Not because she was famous, but because she had done what few could, turn a single moment of injustice into a movement of systemic change. Her voice carried across the auditorium with the same unwavering calm that had once filled the first-class cabin of Flight 9047. This isn't just about seats on a plane, she began, it's about permission, about who's granted the right to be in the room, to lead the conversation, to take up space without apology. That permission has been gatekept for centuries. Sometimes through policies. Other times through silence. She paused. A sea of eyes watched her, some skeptical, most inspired. What I did on that flight was not brave. It was necessary. And if that moment taught us anything, it's this: systems don't just fail in courtrooms or boardrooms. They fail in everyday spaces, airplanes, hotel lobbies, banks, classrooms, where one assumption becomes a verdict. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. She continued, lifting a small card from her notebook. Today, I'm announcing the launch of the Seat at the Table Initiative, a global equity fund dedicated to identifying, training, and empowering underrepresented professionals in travel, tech, education, and finance. Not to teach them how to assimilate, but to ensure the system evolves to reflect who they already are. A standing ovation broke out before she even finished the sentence. The initiative's rollout was swift. Within 3 days, 5 multinational corporations pledged support, including 2 rival airlines that had long fought for market dominance. Within 2 weeks, Amara had raised $30 million in seed funding. Within a month, her team had already begun training frontline staff at partner companies, educating not just about bias, but about dignity. What set Amara apart wasn't just her clarity or her connections, it was her execution. She refused to let her movement become symbolic. It was structural. Measurable. Relentless. Back in New York, Amara's offices at Andromeda Technologies had been transformed. A new department, Public Equity Integration, had been established. Her COO, Melissa Chung, a Korean-American strategist with a background in social psychology, now led a team of 30, developing bias mapping algorithms for client companies. Data tells stories people try to forget, Melissa had said in a recent interview. And Amara? She makes sure the world listens. The company's valuation soared. But for Amara, valuation was not victory. Justice was. Her inbox overflowed with invitations. Panels. Documentaries. Biopics. Brand collaborations. She declined almost all of them. One message stood out, however, a handwritten letter from a young teacher in Mississippi. My black students watched you on the news and said, "She looks like my auntie." She stood up without yelling. Thank you for giving them that image. That, more than the speaking fees, brought tears to her eyes. But not everyone celebrated her rise. Some columnists called her too calculated. Others claimed she had weaponized her wealth. Anonymous forums questioned whether the confrontation had been orchestrated. Even Veronica Hartwell's lawyer had stated to the Times, "My client was misrepresented by the media. She regrets the misunderstanding and believes the consequences she's faced far outweigh the incident. Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She wasn't interested in internet wars. She was interested in infrastructure, in changing the scaffolding of who got to be seen, heard, and respected. One evening, Amara returned home late after a roundtable session with the World Bank. As she stepped into her penthouse apartment, the city lights blinked like soft jewels beneath her balcony. She kicked off her heels and sank into the couch, exhaustion settling in her bones. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was her mother. A video message. She tapped it. The camera showed a small group of girls in matching uniforms, seated in a school auditorium. One by one, they stood and said, "My name is Nia. I want to be a pilot. My name is Danielle. I want to own my own company. My name is Amari. I want to sit in 1A and not be asked why." Her mother's voice followed. "These are the girls I teach in Sunday school. They've been watching you. You're more than a headline to them. You're a mirror." Amara covered her mouth with one hand. Her eyes welled with quiet tears. In that moment, she realized something profound. She had become proof of possibility. Weeks later, Amara returned to Zurich, not for a board meeting, but for a memorial. A veteran steward named Peter, one of the few crew members who had quietly defended her after the incident, had passed away unexpectedly from a heart condition. His family had invited her after reading his journal entries, one of which described the flight. "There was a woman in 1A who changed everything. She never raised her voice. And somehow, I felt safer because she was there." Amara gave a eulogy. She spoke not just of Peter, but of those who stand quietly on the side of justice when it costs them nothing, but mean everything. After the service, as she walked alone through the misty Zurich evening, a woman approached her on the street. Mid-40s. Nervous smile. European accent. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said. "Not for the seat. But for showing us that quiet can be powerful, too." Amara nodded gently. Then walked on. By the end of the year, Seat at the Table chapters had launched in 14 countries. Her model was adopted by 3 global hotel chains. And in Davos, at the World Economic Forum, Amara was named one of the top 10 most influential architects of institutional equity. But her favorite honor came unannounced. It was a photo sent by her sister Nina, taken in a busy airport terminal. A little girl, maybe 9 or 10, was walking confidently through the crowd, pulling a small pink suitcase. She wore a shirt that read, "I don't give up my seat. I take my place." Amara saved it to her phone. It reminded her of where it started, not with power, but with presence. And how presence, held with dignity, could shake the sky. Winter in New York arrived like a whisper, soft flakes falling past the windows of Amara's office as she stood in front of the glass, watching the city slow beneath her. The world had changed, but not dramatically. Not in the way revolutions change things overnight. It had changed subtly, structurally, irrevocably, because someone refused to move. Behind her, framed on the wall, was a photograph. Simple. Black and white. Amara seated in 1A, notebook in lap, eyes calm. Not smiling. Not angry. Just steady. Next to it, engraved in gold lettering, was a single quote. "Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it just stays seated and lets the world adjust." The story had become legend. But Amara had never chased that. She hadn't spoken at award shows. She hadn't sold her story for a film. She hadn't cashed in on keynote tours. She had rebuilt from the inside out, industries, systems, mindsets. And now, 1 year after the flight, she was preparing to return. Not to Zurich. But to the same route. The same airline. The same seat. 1A. Her assistant had booked it quietly, without prompting, understanding that some moments in life weren't about destination, but closure. As Amara arrived at JFK, her presence was familiar, but now, the difference was visible. A young black gate agent greeted her by name. The uniformed manager stood beside her with a tablet, smiling warmly. A line of diverse attendants waited at the jet bridge, all of whom had passed through the new seat at the table bias integrity program launched across the airline 6 months prior. No fanfare. No cameras. Just respect. And this time, it wasn't exceptional. It was expected. As she stepped onto the aircraft, she heard the whisper before she saw the source. "Is that her?" a passenger murmured. "That's the woman from seat 1A. But Amara didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge the gaze. She simply walked, graceful and grounded, and settled into her seat. A young woman across the aisle, perhaps no older than 20, watched her with wide eyes. After a pause, she leaned forward. "Miss James?" she asked hesitantly. Amara looked over, patient. "I just wanted to say, thank you. I'm studying policy now. Because of you. Because that day, you showed the world that being calm doesn't mean being weak." Amara nodded softly. "What's your name?" she asked. "Janelle." Amara smiled. "Well, Janelle, the world is going to need your voice. Use it." The girl beamed, nodding. The engines hummed. The plane lifted. And for the first time in a long time, Amara allowed herself to exhale. Not because the work was finished. But because she had started something that couldn't be undone. Later, during the flight, she pulled out her notebook, the same one from that original trip. Its pages were nearly full now. Meetings, memos, quotes, diagrams. But one page near the back had remained blank all year. Today, she filled it. In bold strokes, she wrote. It was never about the seat. It was about the right to exist without apology. To lead without permission. To walk into any space and not have to prove worth to people who mistake power for privilege. She closed the notebook. And this time, she smiled. Upon landing, Amara was greeted by her Zurich staff, local leaders of the initiative who had trained over 3,000 airline, hotel, and public sector employees in the region. The reforms had worked. Customer satisfaction among historically marginalized passengers had risen by 34%. Staff retention and morale had doubled. Complaints involving discrimination down 62%. But most importantly, conversations had changed. People no longer whispered, "She doesn't look like she belongs." Now they asked, "Why didn't she belong before?" That evening, Amara gave her final public address of the year. It wasn't on a global stage. Not for cameras. Not for investors. It was in a community center in Atlanta, filled with women, elders, students, teachers, and travelers from every background. She stood at a worn wooden podium. And said simply. When they asked me to move that day, what they meant was, shrink yourself, so someone else can stretch. And I said no, not out of defiance, but out of respect. Not just for myself, but for every girl, every immigrant, every black or brown child who's ever been told. You're lucky to be here. Don't ask for more. We're not lucky to be here. We belong here. And no system, no uniform, no smile hiding a scowl will tell me otherwise again. So if my story means anything, let it mean this. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You don't have to be rich to demand dignity. You just have to know who you are. And sit in that truth. No matter how uncomfortable it makes the world around you. The room rose in thunderous applause. People cried. People hugged. And somewhere in the crowd, a child whispered to her mother. One day, I'm gonna sit in seat 1A2. Author's reflection, a message to the community. This story began with a quiet act. One woman. One seat. One refusal to be displaced. But it grew because of you, the people who themselves in her. Because dignity isn't just for the powerful. It belongs to the teacher in the back row. The nurse was waiting to board. The janitor who shows up early. The grandmother is flying home alone. Let this story remind us that every seat we take with honor teaches the world how to treat us. That power can look like silence. Or stillness. Or the ability to say no and mean it. And that when you stand, or sit, for something real, you never sit alone. If this story moved you, share it. Talk about it. Let it live outside your screen. Because every time someone like Amara says, I won't move, the world moves one step closer to justice. Leave your story in the comments. Subscribe for more true tales of quiet revolution. And always, take your place.